Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to The Reload here on Prediction, the esports video talk show network. You can learn more about what's next in the worlds of Call of Duty, NBA 2K, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and others every week here on Twitch. And if you happen to miss a show, no worries, right? You can feel free to catch us on demand on our YouTube channel. One thing to be looking out for is actually going to be Hard Reads Episode 3 with TK Breezy and Austin. That's going to be going down on July 10th tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific, right here on your go-to network for esports analysis content. So if you've been kind of following Call of Duty over the last few days, you've probably seen a few of these headlines and ones that maybe aren't as highlighted as they should be. Starting to kind of make their way through. The great thing about, obviously the Reload here is that we're going to be talking about all of those subjects and kind of highlighting the ones that I feel like deserve to be highlighted in terms of the overall spectrum of what it means to be in Call of Duty esports right now, especially with franchising on the horizon. What does that mean? How is it all going to be influential? We'll be talking about that one today. Now, like I talked about last week, and this is pretty much the exact thing that I was thinking would happen, has in fact happened in terms of the Immortals owner has confirmed that the LA OpTic could be in the books and could be a possibility of happening. Now, I know I mentioned this last week, pretty much word for word. It's kind of funny that like the exact thing that I thought could happen down the road actually happened just maybe a few days after the segment went live. And I really thought this could be a very real possibility. And for those who are a little bit confused on what I'm talking about in terms of what franchising means for next year for Call, it works very similar to sports in terms of the ability to have kind of these designated spots that, these major organizations buy out, these major business partners kind of buy out. They choose a location, and then they're forced to rebrand and make a new name, very similar to the LCS, very similar and pretty much identical to the Overwatch League, which happens to be the brother esport, if you will, the sister esport to Call of Duty in this instance, as both are under the Activision name, under the Activision brand. So essentially, the CDL, which is what's going to be called the Call of Duty League next year. Whenever I say the CDL, that pretty much just means next year. That means the franchise league. So essentially the CDL rules states that the new team chosen for the league must have no prior ties to other esports. And like I mentioned last week, no longer having Gears of War, no longer having CSGO means that the name OpTic has no other name, has no other existence outside of Call of Duty esports. Now, what is this new name exactly? Like I said, for those who are a little bit confused, this name is made for franchising specifically. This is a name that's not going to correlate into anything else. If it will be, it's done by another brand. So instead of being called, in this example, a lot of people have heard of the brand name Team Envy in the Overwatch League. They bought out the Dallas, Texas spot and made their team name Fuel. So much like in regular sports, you have the New York Yankees. Here it is the Dallas Fuel. Now, why is this a big deal in terms of talking about OpTic more specifically? And why is nobody really talking about it? I'll be honest, I think it's really just a major reason is because everyone is thinking the short term. A lot of roster changes have been kind of a factor of that as well. Teams are kind of more focused on champs and more focused on finals, which is key. It's important. And while that is important, it's the phrasing. And this is the way that I kind of look at it in terms of the way that we have the league set up right now and for franchising next year. For those who have kind of heard the terminology, there's always a bigger fish, which for those who have managed to painfully get through the Star Wars Phantom Menace movie, when was like Obi-Wan, I think it's Jar Jar Binks and Qui-Gon Jinn are pretty much all in the underwater ship. They're getting chased down by a giant like fish monster essentially. And it's so dramatic for those who haven't seen it. It's super dramatic. They're trying to dodge around walls and caves. And the one thing that saves them is an even bigger fish, twice the size of the one that was originally chasing them. And the same thing kind of goes on here for Call of Duty esports in terms of the way that no one is kind of looking at the long term. No one is pretty much like looking in the far distance at what that big fish is going to look like and how it's going to engulf everything that is going on right now. And that's the same thing with these announcements in terms of LA announcing that they are going to possibly be keeping the OpTic name, which is massive, which we'll get into here in just a moment. But like I said, I think this is going to be a time period soon in terms of franchising. It's going to catch a lot of people off guard. They're not going to be prepared in terms of what's going to happen next season. They're not really aware of all the implications of this year, pale in comparison to what's going to happen next year, what's going to happen next season, I should say, when it comes down to franchising. Because much like every other esport has dealt with, much like every other esport has seen, everything changes, everything is different, everything is way different than we thought it would have been based off the information that we've been given. So I think this is going to catch off a lot of players, a lot of community members, maybe even a few organizations off guard by how much different and how important really franchising is to the entire idea of Call of Duty esports. So let's kind of get back to the main topic. I just wanted to kind of make that clear because there's not a whole lot of people talking on this story. And while it may seem as if, oh, big deal, let's talk about the Pro League. This is actually, to me, way more influential and way more important in terms of the long game rather than the short game. So since OpTic has established the biggest brand in Call of Duty esports and pretty much one of the largest, if not the largest fan base in terms of the green wall in esports, this is a huge return possibility. Like, this absolutely is a massive return potential if Immortals plays their cards right. And that was one of my big things last week was if they can get this name and manage to get through as unscathed as they can to try to make it through the course without getting, as damaged as they can, they could be in a really good spot. Like, realistically, they could be in a fantastic position heading into next year. And the big issue, or I guess you could say the big issue with everyone else, but the big positive for Immortals in this situation is that every other brand that you'll be going up against has a different name outside of OpTic, right? And the one name that is the most successful, the one name that is the most profitable, if you will, is the one name that is going to succeed. Otherwise, the other brands aren't going to have this same luxury, right? In terms of the FaZe clans out there, in terms of the 100 Thieves, you look at FaZe, right? They make it in franchising next year for COD, which has not been confirmed as of yet. Well, they still have a CS team. They still have a Fortnite team. They still have a FIFA name, just to name a few. 100 Thieves, a lot of people are talking about one of the biggest brands, obviously in terms of Envy, another big brand. They obviously already have a number of different esports, so they fall in the same category. But 100 Thieves, LCS, right? That literally, enough said on that. They're not going to be able to change their name either. So all of the larger brands that have previously existed in Call of Duty or hold a ton of weight in next year's title won't have the name. They won't have the same brand recognition as the name simply OpTic will, right? I mean, OpTic Gaming may not exist, but the term OpTic is going to live on, possibly, and that seems to be the case. It's like I said, this is a massive advantage for Immortals in this spot already, just because the biggest name happens to succeed, but the fact that the biggest name and all of its competition isn't there off the start is going to be important. And I know I say this a lot, but you kind of have to treat your audience as if they have no idea what's going on. So when it comes down to switching to a new location, there's going to be a lot of basic fans out there, and a lot of people are going to be looking at this. A lot of people who even watch this show are hardcore Call of Duty fans. It doesn't apply necessarily to you, but to the average fan out there who watches, the run-of-the-mill Call of Duty event every, few seasons, every, maybe few months they tune in for a little bit. They're going to have no idea who these teams are. They're going to have no idea who, in this instance, let's say that the Fuel translates, which it's not possible to, but let's say the Fuel translates. Who's the Fuel? Like, what is the Dallas Fuel? Who are these guys? Little do they know that happens to be Team Envy, a brand that they've supported for years. But unless they are following it closely, there's no way for them to immediately get that brand recognition, to immediately understand that. They hear the name OpTic, instantly it already clicks. So I feel like in terms of the way that this looks, and I know I mentioned this again last week, but since it is coming to fruition, it's only getting more true. Based off the location and based off the name, the LA OpTic, if it were to be accomplished, would instantly become the Yankees of the league, the Lakers of the league, because of the location, which happens to be in beautiful Los Angeles. I've been there only a few times, but I've never wanted to leave after I've been there. And same thing goes with the players, right? In terms of, and also you have to keep in mind, if the situation stays the same, because for those who have watched the Overwatch League, they pretty much play in the Blizzard Arena. Where's that at? California. They're going to be right next door to the place where the entire hub of the esport is going to continue, which to me would probably be a very good idea if you are the Overwatch League, or if you are, rather at this point, Activision Blizzard. You want to keep them close, right? You want to keep the brands near the same area. You want to have a hub, much like all the franchise spots want to have. They want to have a hub. They want to have a location of which they can kind of build their esports around, which is exactly what, to name one, Dallas Fuel or Envy is doing by having multiple spots in different esports, but all in the same area. So if you're the Overwatch League, or rather if you are, like I talked about, Activision Blizzard, you want to do the same thing. So the fact that you're going to have the name still go through, the location, which is very important because it's LA, and then also because you're going to be right next door to the entire league itself, is going to be a perfect position. And to me, as soon as the name is announced, it will be the Yankees, it will be the Lakers of other sports, but here and translating into Call of Duty esports. And like I said, every brand kind of has their main kind of focal point. But I'll be honest, in every other esport that I've watched, and I've watched a ton of them, Overwatch, Gears of War, Halo, Fortnite, even watching League of Legends, like there is no brand that exists. I mean, there's obviously 10 more out there like Dota, CSGO, etc., NBA 2K, Super Smash Bros., obviously. But you don't really have a brand that exists in an esport and dominates the fan base as much as have OpTic and Con. It's absolutely the truth. There is no brand that dominates viewership the way that OpTic Gaming has done in Call of Duty, and hopefully will continue to a certain extent. And I'd love to see it kind of branch out and be a little bit more even. But we have to get to a certain point and talk about, oh my gosh, all these positives. There's only going to be good things for Immortals. They made the right decision. And while I do believe that based off of their own spot, which you could argue in terms of whether you agree with their decision or not, for them, it was the best decision that they could have made. But they don't get to this point unscathed, right? They don't get to this point. They don't get to the ability to have all of these possessions, to have all of this positivity go their way without a few bumps in the road, if you will. And the biggest thing is the backlash of the fan base, because in terms of the way that this buyout occurred was that Immortals is in control, right? Much like how whenever Infinite took over OpTic Gaming, Infinite was in control. Hex at the time, you could argue, had a lot of different opportunities to take over. Like I said, everyone knows the story. I'm not going to try to get into it and try to dabble into what could have been done, because obviously I wasn't there, so I can't really make any claims. But there was a lot of situations that could have gone differently, and clearly there wasn't enough control to where it should have been located. And when you're in Immortals, you're in a much kind of set in stone kind of system. They have tons and tons of investors. When I say these guys do not mess around, they are one of the biggest brands in all of esports that were willing to buy a very profitable LA spot without even hardly thinking about it. I say not even thinking about it. They wouldn't have to, because of how much money they have, because of the investors, the group that they have kind of entitled together. It's unbelievable. It really, when you look at the names, you look at the brands that are under the Immortals Gaming Club, it's very intimidating. And so the fact that they have all of those things set in stone, they have an infrastructure, it makes kind of punching into that wall, no pun intended, for Hex, so much more difficult to want to have some control. And so in this situation that we find ourselves in order to overtake the OpTic brand through buying Infinite, it has made Hex's situation more difficult, if not impossible, to control the Call of Duty team. He no longer possesses any real ownership. When the Immortals Gaming Club is making decisions, he really doesn't have as much word as he maybe even did on Infinite. Now, while it may be better for the players, obviously you're in the Immortals kind of house now, you're kind of encompassed in their camp. It's way better, but at the same time, it's not what you wanted. It's not exactly the same situation of which you wanted to be in previously, when Infinite, like everyone knows, was not even hardly taken seriously based off the decisions that they made, based off the things that they thought would be good for the brand after having no real history in it. It's very delicate, and you have to handle those things correctly. And I don't think this could have ever gone positive for Immortals, especially after the Infinite situation. I feel like it makes their lives so much more difficult because of all the negativity that's came back with it, with all the talks, with all the podcasts that have been formed, the tweets, the blacked out avatars on Twitter. I mean, all of the drama that has kind of existed with this OpTic versus Infinite situation, it has made Immortals instantly look like the bad guy. And you know, whatever it may be, I'm not 100% sure like what their position is, whether or not they want to offer Hex an opportunity to control a lot of things, or whether or not they're just like, you know, not interested. I'd imagine it's a similar situation, but not to the point where Immortals is corrupt, but to the point where they're saying, hey, this is our brand. We get to do what we want. We bought them out fair and square according to our calculations. We can kind of do with this how we may. And now it's a situation where they're releasing the Gears of War team for their future, right? They're realizing the history and the opportunity that the name OpTic will have in COD. And that's exactly what I thought when they released that team. It was, is there really a financial buy-in with that? I mean, is there really anything that's hurting your brand by having one of the most dominant console teams in esports history, if not the most dominant console esports team in history, you know, at your side? You know, maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit of a loss, depending on, you know, with the prize pools, how everything's changing. There's a lot of rumors next year with Gears of War 5. Maybe it wasn't profitable for them. But at the same time, it was a strategy. It was absolutely a strategy. And maybe in this situation, Hex would have done things a lot different. I doubt they would have dropped the Gears of War team. I think they would have kind of held on and kind of kept the trend going, if you will. But the thing is that everyone knows, and since this has been so public with Infinite, since this has been so public with everyone else, every fan, for the most part, not I'll say this, not every fan, but a majority of the fan base, the hardcore fans, the ones that don't necessarily matter, but the ones that maybe are more invested, more willing to spend money, more willing to kind of be in the aura of what OpTic is, the OpTic green, they know it's not the real one, right? They know it's not the same shade of green. They know it's not the same group who's making these decisions, and that may start to bite Immortals in the end. Despite having the name OpTic, it may not be super well associated. Maybe you'll even have a kind of a split down the middle in terms of what fans or what fans are supporting, which brand, how is it all working out, et cetera, et cetera. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit worried, but at the same time, it's still a win for Immortals. It's the best thing that you can do with the situation that you're given. So it'll be interesting, right? It really will be. It'll be interesting to see how Immortals looks to try and pull off this OpTic name, because a huge majority of the fan base, like I said, knows who is and who is no longer behind the scenes. And it truly is a shame, because I think the man who created it all, for the most part, right, and Hex, is the only guy who knows how to make it work. And you almost kind of lose the magic. You lose the ingredient, if you will, that makes OpTic who they are, based off of who is there. And I think since Hex, the guy, like I said, who's kind of created the OpTic brand, pretty much rose it from the ground up. Obviously, had some help along the way, but it is the main figurehead without question. Since he's no longer there, you notice little things like that. Whenever, okay, we're dropping the Gears of War team. Well, what did the Gears of War team do wrong? What did they really do wrong? That wouldn't have happened under the Hex camp. And obviously, like, so we can go back and forth in terms of whether or not it was worth it, whether or not it was not worth it. You can kind of throw it up in the air. But I guarantee you that would not have happened in the situation, or there would have been another solution found to allow for those players to not want to leave, because obviously they did want to leave. So in that situation, it definitely makes things interesting. So, like I said, it's going to be a continuous story. I'm interested to see how it kind of goes along. But much like I mentioned last week, the situation that everyone was hoping for would be that the Immortals team could not use the name OpTic in franchising, because if they're able to do that, then there's no real chance of Hector buying back the name of OpTic, at least in my opinion. And that's just based off speculation, which proved to be right, thankfully, last week and heading into this week. But since that name could be used, it seems like, I don't know if purchasing the OpTic Gaming name is now worth it, or if it is even possible now, because Immortals is now using it. It wasn't just a throwaway thing that was no longer in use. Immortals says, okay, we're not really getting too much use out of the OpTic name. It'd probably be better to sell it back to Hex, and we kind of keep everything else. So in that situation, who knows what's going to happen? Right? Who knows what is physically possible to occur as the weeks go on? But if you're Immortals, you're making the best of the situation that you're given, and I do give them props. And I also am not surprised, to be honest with you, in terms of the way that the name is established under the brand, the way that the name resonates with viewers out there in terms of the CWL, because the fans know the name OpTic. And I think the CWL is very aware, and the CDL next year, they're very aware how important that name OpTic is to have in the league itself. And I think they're willing to make that sacrifice if need be, while other brands may see it as somewhat of a negative, if you will, because that one brand is keeping their name, and of course it's the most popular guy in class. Why am I not able to do that? So let's go and move on to the next subject, and kind of on the topic of franchising. This was a franchise-like move. Essentially, Genji, a very popular brand in terms of Call of Duty Esports, who will be, from what I've heard, in the league next year in the CDL, which makes their situation a lot more interesting, and it kind of allows us to dive in a little bit more, have released Spacely again for Nagafen. And for those who aren't really aware, essentially Spacely was on the original lineup for Genji. He was the man who kind of organized their team to be with this org, and then he was later dropped off the team. It was obviously a big deal. They later added a few extra pieces. Nagafen was on the original team. And then they decide to release Nagafen, pick back up Spacely. They go 4-0 and this past week in the CWL, and then they drop Spacely again and they pick up Nagafen. Why does that make sense? Or how does that even make sense? What do we kind of look at in terms of what this really means? And I think this was for me, like I said, a franchise type move that Genji is looking to make. And a lot of community members, a lot of people out there, even professionals, kind of hate this roster move. They hate how this was done. They hate how players were shifted around in this instance. But this is how it works in regular sports. It is, right? A player gets a chance to start. If they don't mesh, if they don't play well, they're back to the bench. And while we do see a 4-0 week, I guess you could say, for Genji, clearly the void that Genji was looking to fill in terms of their player base just wasn't there. It just didn't really form the way that they probably had wanted it to. And now the issue that I see, and the reason why fans are angry, like I said, was that they weren't aware of the context of this whole situation. They weren't really aware of the situation that was going on behind closed doors, if you will. All we see as the fans outside of the Genji organization, what the fans, what the community members, what even other pros see who aren't on the inside in this particular roster move, all we see is an announcement that says Spacely added to the main roster for Nagafin. And then we see another headline a few days later saying Nagafin is back in the starting lineup. It's totally normal, and a gut reaction would tell you, what are they doing? Like, what's happening with Genji? What's their end game here? What is their goal to this particular roster change? Because based on what we've seen, they have a lot of indecision. They have a lot of things that just don't seem to be making sense. And I don't think this is more than Genji just trying to fine-tune their roster. I really do. I think this is just them wanting to get the best lineup possible. Maybe even I think it's fair to say patches probably played a factor in terms of how the SMG, for those who may not know, the SOG, which is one of the biggest roles in competitive Call of Duty, along with the Maddox, which is more of a medium-range weapon. But with the SOG update that comes through, which pretty much just makes it way better, just to put it lightly, that may have affected their roster changes in terms of which players they want to have on certain weapons. You know, obviously, kind of switching things around a little bit. But I think this is just them wanting to fine-tune the roster ahead of Miami and ahead of champs as well. And if they have the ability to do it, I don't really mind. I really don't. A lot of people were saying, what is Genji doing? They're out of their mind. They're crazy. Much like we saw with the Envy and Hook move to let him go over to Splice, to have that little 3-month vacation to let her come back to the brand while they're trying to get Gunless on board as well. This is a franchise move, thinking for the future, and not necessarily thinking for next season as Genji, but they're making moves that relate to what we see in franchising in terms of adding a player for a week, seeing how it works out. For those who have watched the Overwatch League, you're thinking, okay, this is just another move. Like, this is just a casual move that we see be done in the OWL. There are some players that are brought in versus certain teams. Like, the substitutes are happening all the time in the OWL, and it may even be a thing in the CDL in terms of franchising for next year. So I think if this was back in the day, though, this particular change, it'd be different. If this player, Spacely, wasn't under Genji, then it's liable for scrutiny. Like, this roster change is liable for scrutiny if this guy wasn't on the team, if they were dropping these guys, not giving them salvage, bringing them back for a week, not giving a whole lot of decision. It would be liable for some critiques. It'd be liable to kind of, like I said, throw out some scrutiny their way in terms of that situation. Because then we could notice, all right, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they want to achieve. It sucks for the players. They don't know what's going on. But I think in this situation, the players know exactly what's going on. They know what they want. They just can't seem to find that particular piece. And like I said, I don't think the players are confused. I think they want a particular player. They want a particular role type, an archetype. Shout out to NBA 2K. One that they can't get, though, at the moment. But they are trying out the final two to see who sticks. And this is going to be a very common trend next year. And depending on how substitutes work, we could see a ton of swaps heading into different weeks of the league, which, like I talked about earlier, it is a common thread. It's something that happens a lot. It's something that happens before all kinds of different matches. And if people aren't ready for it, this is really going to catch them off guard. And this is one of the changes that is kind of getting us ready for next season. Now, I do understand in this case, I know I've referenced it a few times, why people are frustrated. You see a 4-0 scoreline with a substitute, and it seems like things just don't make sense. But clearly Genji have an agenda, right? Clearly they have a plan. Clearly they have a focus. If even after a 4-0 scoreline, they're saying, okay, this just is not happening. And I'll be honest, I was thinking that whenever they made this decision, I didn't really have in the back of my mind that Nagafin could be a piece that they'd bring back because, like I said, the headline situation. But I thought they were going to try to follow in the same lines that 100 Thieves is doing, right? You want to get that dedicated IGL and enable, have someone who can put up numbers from time to time, but it's not his goal. It's not his situation of choice. Let's just say it that way. And a lot of teams normally follow the blueprint of the team who happens to be on top, which, at least in my eyes, a lot of other people's eyes, based off the back-to-back championships, it's fair to say they deserved it. 100 Thieves. But unfortunately, it seems as if that is not the case. And for me, that change immediately told me, okay, they're trying to fine-tune the roster. They're trying to get this mix of something moving forward, and they just can't. Rather, they haven't been able to find it as of yet. But I do feel bad for Spacely, and I think he's a very talented piece, one that can really help a roster succeed a lot. And I hope he does I hope he does find a permanent home throughout the rest of the season, if not for next season, because we've seen Spacely, especially last year and season past, actually take down the team that dropped him at champs, which is always a fun storyline. So big shout out to Spacely. Mike, I know he's going to find a spot. So let's go move on to our last subject, and this is one that I think a lot of people thought was more important than franchising was, but based off the timing that we have left, I'm going to be covering it pretty quickly, just because for me it's a kind of set in stone thing. It's a set in stone topic that I've thought about for a while, and this also does translate to a number of different esports. I know a lot of the esports shows that we have here on Prediction kind of fall under the same category and have had a similar situation to this many times previously. Now, this conversation pretty much is sparked up by a tweet coming from United's own Call of Duty professional, one of the greats of all time, the Phenom Clayster, where he pretty much just tweeted out saying that it was pretty much a headline that actually came from HLTV, a CSGO brand that exists, kind of a media brand that exists in Counter-Strike, pretty much just tweeting out that ZywOo won an MVP award for ESL 1 Cologne 2019. For those who don't watch Counter-Strike, it's all good. I'll cover this really quickly. There was an event that just happened. Made it down to the grand finals, Vitality versus Team Liquid, and this rookie, essentially, a very talented op player, sniper player, named ZywOo, was having a phenomenal event, rather has had a phenomenal last few months, if you will, and has recently turned up and had a fantastic grand final despite his team losing. But he won the MVP. And that's where a lot of people instantly, it's almost as if people have a switch. It's like whenever you hear that, you either switched up and said, finally, like we have finally seen someone win an MVP despite being on the losing side, or on the other side of the switch, it's a matter of someone saying, okay, that's not right. He didn't win the tournament, yet he won the most valuable player award. How can the most valuable player be on a team that didn't win? So that's like, it's kind of like one or the other. And I get both arguments. I get both sides of the coin. But this is a conversation that esports, and especially Call of Duty, we've had for a very long time. What defines an MVP? What defines the most valuable player? And I've said this in a number of different shows in my history that I've done on Call of Duty esports. And I've said this on the record, and I still will say it. I don't want the most valuable player on my team. I really don't. I don't care if I was to own an organization, if I was the manager, the coach, whatever it may be. I don't want there to be a clear number one on my roster, because and like I said, if it works out that way, it's fine. But perfectly wise, in a perfect world, you want all of your players to be the exact same. So whenever they load into a series, whenever they load into a particular map, they're all playing at the same, kind of skill level. You're not saying, wow, I wish we would have had this guy in this spot. I wish we would have had this guy in this position. Like I said, every player is going to have their strong suits. Every player is going to have their weak moments. But for the most part, you shouldn't want a clear number one, without question, player on your team. Look at the biggest names in Call of Duty esports right now in terms of the teams that are having success. Look at 100 Thieves, right? Kenny, Slasher, Octane, everybody has the chance, has the key. Priesthood, no offense to Enable, like I said, IGL. All those guys had the chance to win the MVP. You look at Genji, you look at OpTic, you look at a number of these teams, while they may have somewhat of a known number one player, it's not too far off from the second guy. It's not it's not leagues and bounds above the next guy. It doesn't work like that. It's a consistent unit. It's a consistent team that has kind of a basis around him, if you will. It's like I said, it's like you don't look at this group of players, you don't look at this team and see one rising star. It is guys who are all in combination with each other. So to say that I don't want the most valuable player on my team doesn't mean that I don't want to have the best player. It just means that I would rather choose consistency over one star guy and a bunch of medium players, or a bunch of average players, run-of-the-mill guys. I don't want that. I want a consistent team, and if that means not having the MVP, totally fine. Because an MVP in comparison to trophies, a championship trophy, which one would you rather have? I think I'd rather choose the championships. So like I said, my idea is that your goal shouldn't be, as a winning team, to always look toward having the best player, especially in 5v5 and especially in regular sports. And if you're looking at the NBA or whatever it may be, I know in NFL it's a little bit different in terms of the roles, the way that certain positions work out. But in terms of the NBA, at the very least, when you have 5 players in comparison to 4, it's a lot different to a certain way as well. So you kind of have to rely more on a team effort than just a sole player performance, if that makes sense. So Rely on your teamwork, and those highlights will come, but it shouldn't shine above the teams that have a clear rising talent. And a quick little NBA fact before we close things out. Just as an example, because this even reaches professional sports, the last time in the NBA Finals a player has been awarded MVP for losing, anyone know? Probably not. I didn't know this. Was the 1969 NBA Finals when Jerry West won it after averaging 37.9 points per game, along with, I think it was like 7 assists, if my mind serves me correct. That's what it took, and it has been so long until now, right? It has been a very long time. Let me even get the exact math to this date. I'm trying to figure out how long it has been since 1969. How long has it been since 1969? Just to get the exact figures. It has been... I'm still having an issue. I can't find... Oh, wait. I just got a record that said something totally different. Regardless, it's been a long time. It has been a very long time since we have seen anyone be able to achieve a championship, or rather a title, for losing. 50 years. There we go. That was what I was looking for. It's been 50 years since we have seen a player on the losing team win an MVP trophy, which is insane to me, because the title, most valuable player, I think it kind of has the name along with it. I think it's kind of self-explanatory when you really look at it. And I think it's been kind of an ongoing trend that someone eventually started that said, you know what, how can the most valuable player not win? Because how is he valuable if they're not even winning? That's not necessarily true. How do they get to the finals is almost as important as how you play in the finals. Now, I do agree that clutch and all those things come into play, and all those things are a factor. But if you really look at it, I think back then, and I think even looking toward the future, there's been a number of different series. I know LeBron, whenever he was playing against the Warriors, had I think the highest percentage in shooting. He had the most points, assists, blocks, steals, rebounds, everything, and they still gave it to another guy who had, decent stats, but they were nowhere in comparison to the guy who was on the losing team. And it was clear, if you watched the NBA back then, which was only a few years ago, who the best player on the floor was, who was the most valuable asset to their team. 3 consistent stars, which is what I would prefer, and obviously the NBA worked out that way. But would you rather have 3 consistent players, or the one who was clearly the MVP? Based off of voting, based off of results, I think it's fair to say you'd rather have 3 consistent guys. So that's why I think that the MVP award should be looked upon as different, and why, much like we saw here, with ESL1 Cologne, that just because a player lost doesn't mean they were not the most valuable player. It does not mean that they weren't the most valuable asset for their team. The name by itself signifies, without any prior history, the most essential player to a team. The player can only get so far, but talent, to me, shouldn't be penalized. At least that's the way that I look at it. Feel free to let me know, and feel free to even type in chat. Let us know. Continue the conversation on Twitter at Prediction, with, of course, 2 E's, myself at Lando. And I want to appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching the reload here on Prediction. I appreciate a lot of you guys kind of coming over from our 2K show as well. But like I said, guys, you can feel free to visit our YouTube channel as well to kind of stay up to date on all things analysis, or rather esports analysis content based. So I really want to thank you guys so much for watching, and feel free to catch us on demand. If you missed any point during the show, you came in a little bit late, no worries. You can catch us on our YouTube channel on demand there. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.